Thank you so much for going on this absolutely grotty night. I'm Jackie Hill-Murphy, and I'm convener for Geography and Adventure, to introduce you to Oliver. Now, Oliver is Technology Director at Scott Logic, and he's also my nephew. Just have to get that bit in. He's a fine young man, and I met up on a train, hadn't seen him for a long time, and I said, wouldn't it be brilliant if he came and gave this talk at Bath Royal Society of Literature and Science. He's part of the Government Digital Sustainable Alliance Central Government Department, and part of this talk will be part of a central government innovation, which I think he's going to talk to you about, because part of this lecture is going to be heard at Whitehall very soon. I'm hoping he'll fill you in. But anyway, to have a interesting evening, and I think you may be shocked by what he's going to say. So let me introduce you to Oliver Cronk.
Thank you, Jackie. Yeah, it was quite a serendipitous train journey, that one, from Paddington back to Newbury, where I live. So look, I've given a variance of this talk across Europe and actually a couple of times even in the States, but this is a different flavour because of the conversation that Jackie and I had on that train, explaining the nature of BRSLI. And I wanted to kind of connect the geography topic, which I'm very passionate about, but I guess more of an amateur on, with the technology world that I'm very much, have 20 plus years experience of working in. And as Jackie said, I'm working very close. I don't work for central government, I should clarify that. I work as a supplier to central government, and I'm part of a group that's looking at how we reduce the impact of digital on the natural world. Because actually it's a pretty hidden thing, if I'm honest. A lot of us go around using our devices, using internet services, not really appreciating what really goes on underneath the hood. And so this talk is going to be a bit of a journey, I'm afraid. There is going to be some home truths. There's going to be a little bit, I suppose, of an awakening of, and some of you may already be aware of some of these things. I'm going to use quite a lot of photos to sort of bring it to life with real geography impact. And then actually we'll move towards more of an optimistic, well, I personally find optimism through some amazing innovation and some ingenuity out there that is looking to do good with what is massive, energy consumption and materials consumption. So yeah, we've got a bit of a journey. So the structure of this is going to be essentially a little bit of how is digital transforming geographies, the resource demands of our digital lives. There's a piece of work that I've done with my team, and it's called the Technology Carbon Standard, and that's what we've been doing a lot of work with central government on, which is essentially understanding the full life cycle of impacts that technology has on the real world. And then I'm going to deep dive into a bit on AI, because this is a topic that a lot of people are really fascinated by at the moment. What are the impacts of AI? Because it's really accelerating the problem, if I'm honest. And this is, as Jackie said, subject which I will be giving at Whitehall. I can't give you all the ins and outs on live stream, but I can, after the event, for those in the room, tell you a little bit about what that is. But essentially, it's going to be advising the government on how we can find a pragmatic path forward with AI that isn't so resource intensive, but still benefits the UK in a positive way. So yeah, that's the sort of middle part of my talk. And then essentially, I aim to end positively with how can we use technology to better understand and protect our environment, and how can actually we reimagine how we use big technology data centers to do smart things, in a regenerative kind of manner. The picture on the right is what was put online recently for the talk. I actually used, and I have a love-hate relationship with AI, so you will see there's some AI-generated images in this talk, including the one previously. But actually, it generated this for me, which is actually what I fear is happening. I fear there is an awful lot of technology blinding people to the realities of what's going on in the world, be that natural disasters, be that societal disruption. I do fear, and I see this with my own children, that many are being sucked into sort of a digital reality that does not represent the real base reality of the natural world. And it increasingly worries me that there is this almost deliberate distraction of the real world going on with some of the technology use that we're seeing and the tech addiction that's happening. So I saw the graphic that was put up online for the talk, and I thought, no, actually, that reminds me of unfortunately, the darker reality that can be unfolding. So before we go further, a little bit on me and my background and why am I here talking to you about this. So I actually was born literally a couple of months before the personal computer came onto the scene. So I've kind of grown up with personal computers through the 80s and the 90s. And it was always a real juggle for me as to whether I went into computing or science. I absolutely loved science as a child. And so I've still remained passionate about sciences. I started my career, so getting off 25 years ago as a programmer. I then went and worked for an energy and environmental consultancy, doing work for DEFRA, the European Commission at the time, and the Environment Agency and so on, building systems to help track emissions and environmental impact. And then I went, unfortunately, because of the financial crisis of 2008, a lot of those programs got the funding killed off because they needed to bail out the banks, unfortunately. So I then went and worked in various other sectors, including the energy sector. And then, now more recently, the role I'm in now, I'm very fortunate I'm able to get back into sustainability in the role I am at Scott Logic. I also run a podcast called Architect Tomorrow, which is very much looking at how technology can help build a better tomorrow. And so I use my sort of network of connections that I've worked with in the past and other people online to talk about the big pressing problems that technology needs to try and face into. And so a little bit on this isn't a sales pitch, don't worry, but a little bit on who Scott Logic are, because it's relevant. So we're a UK software engineering consultancy. We're also a B Corp. For those who don't know what B Corp is, it's a social enterprise. It's an organisation that has signed up to the B Corp certification that looks at your social impact or environmental impact. So yeah, we're very much a social enterprise. We were formed to create employment for people in the Northeast in the financial services technology space, because 20 years ago this didn't exist. So our founder, Gary Scott, hence the name, created Scott Logic in Newcastle to create employment opportunity for those up in the Northeast, and then we've expanded and we're now about 450 people. And a lot of us are very technical, and so we're hired generally for our deep technical expertise. So I always like to ask people I present this to, a show of hands, who's come across the UN Sustainable Development Goals before? Okay, so about half of you. Okay, so I tend to use these as the sort of grounding and the starting point for the work that we've done. Because rather than reinvent the wheel, I think it's useful to sort of look at what is sustainability and how can technology impact sustainability in a positive way and also in a negative, which is where we're going to start. What we did was we mapped out where does technology have a significant impact. And what was really eye-opening for us as a team is that it's not just energy consumption. A lot of the talk out there, particularly from the big technology companies, is it's all about energy. And as long as that energy is powered via renewable sources, solar, wind, hydro, nuclear, then the tech industry is clean and we're doing a good job as a technology sector and we don't need to worry. The reality is far, far different. The reality is energy consumption is only really a third, or maybe up to half in some cases, of the challenge that we face as a technology sector and our impact on nature. The far bigger impact comes from, hopefully some of you know the term embodied carbon, which is basically the energy and the emissions that go into making technology products in the first place. So be that laptops, desktop servers, infrastructure. That actually has a significant impact. Why? Because we're refreshing those devices on a regular cycle, but also they're often manufactured in parts of the world where the carbon intensity of the grid, so the energy fuel mix, of the electricity that's used to produce these devices in factories is incredibly high. So parts of Asia have a much higher carbon footprint for electricity than they do in Europe or even the States. So that's a double whammy really. And then it's got to be transported halfway around the world. You often have complex supply chains. You have minerals extraction in one part of the world has to be shipped to another, and all around the world. So there's a huge impact in the manufacturing and shipping and distribution of technology. And then the other part is what happens at the end of life. What happens when someone gets bored of their phones, and they decide it's time for a new device. Well, unfortunately, very little of those devices gets properly recycled. And I'm going to deep dive a little bit in a minute about what actually happens to our electronics when we choose to try and recycle it, because unfortunately the journey isn't a great story. And then, probably should have started here, but like the materials consumption for technology is insane. I hadn't appreciated this until we started looking at the numbers. Here's another question. I'm going to be one of those annoying presenters that asks random questions. For this, say, 2 kilogram laptop here, how many kilograms of materials do you think it requires to produce a 2 kilogram laptop? Any ideas? Rough shouts? More? Anyone else? A ton? Yeah, so it's not far, it's about 900 kilograms of materials extracted from the ground to then be refined and and made purer into internal loads, because it's not just the silicon, it's the casing, it's often metal or aluminiums and so on. So it's staggering, and that's just one laptop. Yeah. Then there's also the land usage. So, we're increasingly building data centers as well as the mines, of course, and other factories. But, the land usage is twofold as well. It's not just the land usage, which displaces like wildlife clearly directly from the land that's being used. It's also the impact of water. So you may have heard in the news, like the cheapest way to cool a data center, to cool computing, to allow it to operate, is to use water. And actually it makes you look more efficient, because if you use electricity to cool, you don't look as efficient. So what we do when we incentivize people to be as electricity efficient as possible is they start consuming vast amounts of water and evaporating it. Often in parts of the world that are incredibly water stressed. There's a part of Spain actually where this is a chronic problem, and the farmers are up in arms that data centers are essentially taking water that should be used for agriculture away from them. So there's a lot of hidden impacts. So what we did at Scott Logic was create this impact framework, I've created a more generic version of this for this talk, but essentially it talks about these three buckets, really. It talks about upstream, operational, and downstream. And you can apply this to carbon emissions, you can apply it to water, you can apply it to nature impact or social impact. And the idea is that we start breaking this problem down. So I won't go through all of this in detail. I'm happy to sort of take a conversation offline. There's a website that I can share with you. But essentially there's upstream, which is the software that we buy. It's the hardware we buy, so the phones, the laptops, any networking infrastructure that organizations use, the servers and the storage. So it's the purchased hardware. And if it's AI, it's the creation of those AI models. If we're buying content, so films or other data, that's content and data, that also has a footprint, creating that and storing that somewhere. And then operational, which I talked about earlier as being where a lot of people often focus. That's the electricity that's consumed by our devices, by our computers, by the internet, by servers and so on. And backup generators, of course, also have an impact here if they're running on fossil fuels, which often they are. So many technology companies rely on gas turbines, for example. There's a horrible example of this, unfortunately, with the Cronk AI, the ex-AI, Elon Musk's AI. They have a huge amount of gas turbines, essentially, in shipping containers, powering a lot of the AI. And that's how they were able to stand up an AI data center in weeks, was they basically put shipping container gas turbines in the car park. So they're certainly not renewable, a lot of these data centers. And then indirectly, if we're buying cloud services, if we're using things like Salesforce or other services on a day-to-day basis, those things still live somewhere. They're just someone else's electricity bill is where the footprint sits. So yeah, that's the sort of indirect piece. And then downstream, so if I work with government, these government services that are built, the online websites and the apps, all of those have an impact on consumer behavior. So if you build a bad app, as in one that's not very efficient or effective, it might force someone to go, you know what, it's time for me to buy a new device because this just isn't working properly. So it sort of feeds into the problem of material consumption. And so yeah, again, won't go into all the ins and outs here, but essentially these are the three sort of impacts. And as I say, a lot of the tech greenwashing that's out there tends to focus the attention on operational only. Don't worry about everything because we've got renewable energy, or we've got power purchase agreements for renewable energy, and so therefore don't worry, we're green. As I said, the reality is hardware devices can actually be 60% or more of the problem, and the operational is somewhere between 30 and 40%, with then downstream being somewhere around the sort of 1 to 2%, unless you're a huge e-commerce type company like an Amazon, where that can start to get significant because you've got millions, if not billions, of users. So yeah, like I say, the thing we're ignoring is the hardware, and the other thing downstream, as I say, is the e-waste, which I'll deep dive on in a minute. So I said I'd have some pictures while I put this on the screen and grab some water. So this is one of many open cast mines, but there are also deep underground mines as well. And I should say that electronics actually isn't the worst culprit when it comes to mining, like other industries like construction, cement and so on, steel for buildings is actually very bad as well. So there's a whole range of different types of mining out there. But what's interesting in doing my research is that mining is responsible for over 90% of land-related biodiversity loss. So we talk about deforestation and things like that. The reality actually is these massive great big holes in the ground that we're creating. And not just the holes, the runoff, the water runoff, the tailing ponds that you may have heard of. Often the dams break in these tailing ponds, releasing toxic chemicals into local watercourses. These toxic chemicals are created when you effectively extract the material that you want for electronics, and it creates toxic waste as a byproduct. Often these things, by the way, aren't picked up by the companies doing the mining. They're picked up by governments around the world that then, many years after the mine has finished, the governments have to pick up the cost for dealing with this. So this is actually a very recent picture of a rare earth. I think it was Vietnam or one of the Asian countries, where it's literally just right next to the forest. And the amount of rare earth elements that we now need to produce has gone up, orders of magnitude. In 1995, we needed 75,000 tons of rare earths. Now we need nearly half a million tons of rare earths, and that's only going to go upwards as we want more and more devices, and as more of the world comes online. We have about, I think, 5 billion internet-connected people now, but that's only going to go up as global population grows. This is, I should say, this was an example of the upstream, the kind of the manufacturing, and I've skipped over factories and distribution and all that sort of stuff. I'm just sort of giving you a snapshot of some of each of the three, otherwise I'd be here all night. So this is operational, a picture today. So it's insane how many data centers there are now. I think there is, in fact, actually, I've got a little quiz for you again, so a bit of audience participation, but to give you an idea. So this is one of the massive data centers in the US. Here's a map now of global data centers, or at least the West. There are obviously others around the world. Does anyone want to give an estimate of, the dots give you some idea of number? Anyone want to throw out a rough idea of how many data centers there are now around the world? Sorry? 1,000. So it's a bit more than your estimate, Jackie. So we're getting up to that 5,500 data centers. That's just in the US. Apologies. It's actually closer to 12,000 globally. Apologies. The latest numbers. Anyone want to guess where the UK is in the top 5? What position we sit? And a rough number, if you want to throw out. No. Third? Is that? Yeah. So we're third. So the US is first with like 5,500, as I said, or nearabouts. Germany is second with 529. The UK 523. And we just don't know about these things because they're often quite what's known as sort of dark sites. They're not advertised. Amazon doesn't put up a big sign saying here's one of our data centers because for security reasons, for physical security reasons, often these companies don't want to declare where these sites are. China, I was surprised actually. China is only 449. I'm fairly convinced that's going to grow massively from what I'm hearing of China's AI research and development. And France is also doing a lot because it's got stable nuclear power. And so you've got the likes of Mistral in France, who are a French AI company doing a lot of work. So yeah, I think we're only going to see those numbers grow. And by the way, this is as of last year, when the AI sort of boom that we're currently experiencing was only really kind of just getting started. We have a huge number in development and build out right now. So something else that's out of mind is the subsea cables that sit around that connect the internet. Appreciate it's probably a bit late and it sounds like you're not wanting to answer questions, but I will ask one more, which is how long do you think all the undersea cables are that go around the world to connect us up around the world on the internet? How many? I'll give you a clue. It's in millions of kilometers. Anyone? Okay. 2.8 million kilometers of fiber optic cable around the world now. Did a bit of digging into this. It turns out in a lot of cases, once the cables are buried, the impact on marine life is fairly minimal. It's the laying them that often is disruptive. But yeah, to sort of think that level of sort of infrastructure build out, and again, it's hidden, right? There's the map on the right shows that they go all around the world. There's a huge amount of them coming to the southwest, not far from Bath, and it's pretty mad. So. It's out of sight, out of mind, the tech infrastructure. 2.8 million kilometers of cable. Just think about the energy, let alone the materials that were required to produce 2.8 million kilometers of fiber optic cable. And so here's one that's really quite horrible. And so we will rapidly try and get a bit more positive after this. But I talked about e-waste, and unfortunately, really bad things happen to our electronic equipment once we throw them away. And this, I've done quite a bit of digging, but unfortunately, the e-waste dump in Accra in Ghana appears to be one of the worst. And it's just really quite sickening what happens at this e-waste dump. The aerial view here is actually lots of people setting fire to toxic electronics. Why do they do this? To release the gold and silver and other precious metals that they can get when they burn away everything else that is toxic but isn't valuable enough to sell. So you have these horrible pits, these kind of landfill sites that are right next to residential areas in Accra. And 41 million tons of electronic waste generated globally, and we only recycle, at best 20% properly a year. And so much of it just ends up in the global south, again, out of sight, out of mind, someone else's problem, someone else's health issue, quite frankly. Hopefully this video will play. If not, I can send you all, the link is in the slides. You may have an advert to get through first.
What if you could send money overseas in seconds?
Just going to skip ahead to the part where there's livestock. Here you go. This is what I want to show you. This is someone burning a whole bit of wires. So I'm conscious of time. I've kind of spent quite a lot of time telling you about the horror stories. So I will, actually no, it's 25 minutes. Sorry, I thought we started at 7. We started at 7:30, didn't we? So here's the part I'm going to be talking to government about in a few weeks' time. So we have this perception, as I said earlier, that technology is often clean and green because of commitments that are made around renewable energy production, consumption. And so the other comparison we hear a lot at the moment is a comparison of what we're doing with AI with the railway network. So many of you may know that, like in the 1800s, when the railway network was built, it was it wasn't an economic success to start with. There was a lot of bankruptcy and abandoned projects and so on. And so I kind of wanted to draw a bit of an analogy here with trains and what we're doing with AI. So this is a Swiss train, going through a nice part of the Swiss mountainside. And I think the only thing that's probably a little bit worrying about this train right now is it's going into a tunnel and we're not quite sure what's going to happen in the tunnel maybe. Everything's green, everything looks great. And I think it's just, there's a narrative at the moment that this is just going to fix everything. It's the best thing since trains, right? And the assumption is we'll just find a way to make this work. There's a huge amount of data centers being built to support it, huge amount of social disruption, huge amount of energy consumption, materials, and so on and so forth. But the assumption is we'll just find a way to make it work, and we'll make it more efficient along the way. And the main problem I have with all this is there's a huge lack of transparency. There's just an absence of data in what's really going on in a lot of these data centers. Those 11,000 odd data centers, we really don't know, what the water consumption is, what the energy consumption is, because right now there's no, apart from in the EU and new regulation coming out in the EU, there isn't really a huge amount of onus on these operators to actually be transparent and publish what the actual impacts are of their services. The reality is the picture looks more like this. Okay? And I deliberately created a stark, you see I've used a bit of AI, and the original first picture was a real picture. I've used AI to help me create this picture, and I've got another one in a minute. And the reality is The train is a silver bullet. So, you know, the kind of the story of the silver bullet is it's the thing that will fix everything. It's this magical solution that will just solve all, you know, all world's problems. Unfortunately, there's a major problem. As you can see, the bridge is missing, and the train is at best going to go off the rails. The reality is it's probably going to come crashing down into the valley, unfortunately. And there's this sort of blind faith and hope. And I say some of these things, by the way, not just my opinion. There was a fantastic Royal Society event a couple of weeks ago in London, but with academics and people like Google DeepMind and so on there, talking about, you know, the hope, the huge amount of hope there is that we're just funding these projects and spending, you know, billions, if not trillions of dollars on the energy, you know, be that fossil fuels, be that whatever. And the reality is, it's a massively brute-forced approach to trying to fix something with a lot of uncertainty. You know, we're using a huge amount of power. We're on course to, you know, use record amounts of power in AI. The water and materials consumption don't even bear thinking about if we continue on this present course. And so the left-hand side of the picture really shows that, you know, we're losing that green mountainside. It's certainly not green. It's covered in, you know, factories. It's covered in fossil fuel plants. And increasingly, we're littering the world with our electronic waste that we just don't really deal with properly. We just ship it to parts of the world that we don't, you know, where we don't see it. You know, so yeah, it has huge, you know, knock-on impacts that we're just not seeing. Building on that, we're also being told that this train, if we give it enough energy and materials and power, it's just going to magically fly over this bridge. It's going to cross this chasm of, you know, and we'll enter this, you know, amazing world of super intelligence where everything will be done for us and it'll, you know, it'll be magical. The reality is I've been working, you know, with technology and AI for over 20 years, and, you know, it's an incredibly sophisticated mimic of human behavior. It's certainly not intelligent like you or I. And it's, you know, and the academics and others are doing some great research that show that this approach we're on, we can throw as much energy at this problem as we like. It's not going to happen. It's not going to magically jump over the bridge, or at least it's very, very unlikely to. So yeah, as I say, the train will, you know, magically just get to this AGI, which is artificial general intelligence, if we give it enough resources. And I'd say that that's just a fallacy. Excuse me, it's a fallacy. The other thing that we need to point out here is that the reason I've made the train fluorescent is that the train rides on the foundations of the internet, right? All the new generative AI models that are out there, certainly the text-based ones like chatbots, have been trained on the internet as a data source. The problem we have now is we have 2 years of AI generating data and flooding the internet with fake data, essentially. It's not real human data or content. And there's various studies, like there's a particular one in Nature that shows that if you train these AI models with synthetic data, it's like a worm eating its own tail, and they eventually fail. And it doesn't actually take that long for these models to start babbling out absolute nonsense, you know, if they're trained on too much synthetic content. So, you know, essentially, these systems are eroding their own ability to work. We're running out of data, and the reason that the tunnel has turned into a sheer a wall is that we're going to hit, even if we do magically, you know, get the train to fly with enough speed, it's going to hit this wall, and it's what's known as a scaling wall. So for some time, AI and machine learning researchers were saying, if you just give AI enough data, enough power, enough compute, it will just keep getting better. There's a scaling law that it'll just keep getting better. The reality is we found that we hit a wall, you hit a limit, mainly because we only have so much content, so much data to train these things on. There's only so many places we can build data centers, only so much power we can give these data centers. But fundamentally, it just doesn't work. You know, it hits a limit. It's not a law. Like the papers that are out there have been debunked. The people that were pushing this as a concept, most of them have now turned around and said, yes, it's not a law. It's been shown that this runs out of track, essentially. And so you hit a wall rather than continue to scale. And then what I'd really like to position is that actually the reality is we still need human expertise at the center of all this. You may not be able to see, but there's some pictures of some climbers going up the wall. And I think rather than this sort of silver bullet train, what we really need is to be thinking about arming people with the right tools. So these things are tools. They're not some way of just, you know, sort of swiping people out of you know, irrelevance. You know, people need to be in control of their own destiny. People are still the best, you know, arbiter or decision point for what tool should be used when. And that's what we should really be encouraging, is seeing these things as tools, not as some, you know, amazing money-making scheme that's just going to, you know, change the surface and the fabric of reality, of society even. You know, it's still going to be people that need to be empowered by these things. So with that sort of slightly doom and glooming story, what I wanted to do was give you some positive stories, so it's not all bad. There are some really amazing examples of where technology can be part of the solution. And so actually, the really great thing is some of these are UK companies as well. They're doing some amazing things. So the first one is we can rethink heat. So at the moment, computers need to be kept cool. And we throw the waste heat away. Often we evaporate it out of the building, or air conditioner chillers, send it out into the sky. There are many now, well, a handful of smart companies realizing actually this is free heat that can be used to heat up things. There's an amazing data center in London that uses the waste heat to heat up a swimming pool, which means the local council pays, I think, like 10% of the bill they used to pay for heating the swimming pool, which is amazing. There's another UK company called Heater, and what they're doing is putting a small server on the side of people's hot water tanks, and it provides 80% of their hot water for free. They get paid for the electricity that computer consumes, so they don't pay for that. So they essentially get 80% of their hot water without having to pay for it. And the beautiful thing there is it's effectively carbon negative, because you're displacing gas that would have been used to heat up that water, and you're also doing a compute workload as well. So you're actually getting something like 0.3 kilograms positive, because you're displacing two energy sources and using it for one. Sorry, getting lots of work out of it for the same sort of consumed unit of electricity, which is incredible. So this is like piloting. It could scale, but it requires us to reimagine and rethink. Like, this is distributing the problem across people's homes rather than centralizing it into massive data centers. The other thing is, there's been some studies, this one's from Ireland, that show that if you were to look at the waste heat from data centers, you could use those to help do agri-farming. So we could do more vertical farming and so on throughout the year by using the waste heat. And in fact, many people are now saying we need to stop calling it waste heat. We used to call it heat and reusing heat. In Bristol, where I'm based, there's heat networks. So many cities in parts of Scandinavia have been really big on creating heat networks to heat their homes rather than individual gas boilers. So we can tap into these networks. It's going to require us to rethink though where we put data centers. Does it make sense to put a data center somewhere actually rural, where there is perhaps good renewables supply, offshore wind and so on, but actually it could be used for farming? Or actually, do we need to put compute in residential care homes? There's a company in Holland, I went to see them earlier this year, called LeafCloud. And what they do is they put a whole lot of computers in a cupboard in a care home, an elderly care home, and they say it's amazing to put compute there because an elderly care home needs to be super warm all year round. They need lots of hot water, they need lots of heating. And they get the room to put their computers for free in exchange for providing heat. So it's like a barter, it's like an exchange of value. And actually in Amsterdam, you can't open a data center in Amsterdam if you tried, because the government won't let you. So the only way you can really get your infrastructure up and running in Amsterdam right now is to do creative things like this, is to find places to put your compute. So they're doing really well on that side of things. So like I say, there are ways of rethinking how we run compute and think about the kind of byproducts of it and using them positively. And heat is certainly one of those. And the benefit there, of course, as well, is that you reduce the amount of water that you're consuming as well for cooling, because you've got closed loop systems where you're not evaporating water into the sky, which is fresh water, which is just mad, quite frankly, to be evaporating fresh drinking water into the sky, particularly in parts of Arizona and Spain and places where water is constrained. And then my final part of the talk is where technology is helping with the planet. Where is it helping with geography and geographical sort of challenges? And again, I come back to the Sustainable Development Goals again, because I like to kind of use these as a grounding. There are quite a few categories here. I won't go through all of them in detail. I'm going to pick a couple. But yeah, there are some great examples out there of where we are using technology for good. The issue I have of this, and the reason I put it at the end, is that this is often also used alongside the fact that tech companies just use renewables and therefore they should be off the hook. These are often used as examples of how technology is positive, forgetting, of course, that a lot of technology is also being used to help oil companies extract as much oil from the ground as possible. So there's this concept of enabled emissions. But look, these are positive examples, but I think we have to realize these are only a small percentage of the things that tech is being used for. So this is an example of Earth observation. So Earth observation for me is fascinating. Where I actually live, my office is Bristol, but I actually live closer to Oxfordshire, and there's the Harwell Science Campus actually is fantastic. There's a whole load of UK space science going on there, which I never realised until I went to an open day a few months ago. And yeah, Earth observation is massive, and this is obviously a photograph, but there are infrared, UV, there are various other types of Earth observation happening through different parts of the spectrum to look at, for this example, it's looking at glacier melts, looking at ice coverage of parts of the world, but you also have it looking at deforestation, you have it looking at heat islands, heat output, and so on and so forth. You even have things like looking at tracking cars parked in companies' car parks to sort of figure out how many people are working from home or coming into the office. So there's some fantastic things we can do with Earth observation data, and that's been going on for some time, but the quality and the resolution is improving, so you can do some really detailed analysis. There's a couple of links here for afterwards. The European Space Agency's got some great material you can go and check out, and earthobservations.org is a good resource as well. This is one I like because it comes back to what I was talking about earlier, in that it talks about the carbon intensity of the electricity. This is actually a screen grab I took a couple of years ago, but the picture looks roughly similar if you did it on any kind of day. This is October 2022, and you can see the colours represent the carbon intensity. So the greener the country is, the lower carbon the electricity is. So you can see Poland and Germany are quite dark. That means they're using more gas and more coal in their electricity production. And so there's some amazing sort of tooling out there that helps organizations work out where should I put my operations, or where could I shift my compute workload to. The UK is a bit misleading because if you look at the UK as a whole, it gets averaged out. But the reality is that if you were to zoom into Scotland and the northeast, it's often very green, and the south is often quite red. So the UK, even though it says like average, we're around the sort of 100 to 200 sort of grams of carbon for any kilowatt hour of electricity produced. But the reality is Scotland can be as low as 5 or 20, when the south can be as high as 320. So this is what frustrates me with technology companies. Often they're running their data centers in London, but they're taking the average figure from the UK and claiming that they're low carbon, when the reality is that London is often 300 or 250 plus grams. So it's a nuanced picture, but maps like this, and if you drill down into the even more granular data that you can get to, it's a really useful tool for understanding. And this is just one example of a mapping tool, right? There's loads of what is GIS, geographical information systems, that I've worked with through my career. We've used them for sort of plotting where emissions are from coal-fired power plants, for example. Looking at livestock issues, looking at nature decline. There's a whole bunch of layers that you can overlap over the top of mapping, which are really, really useful for nature protection. And then the other thing you may have heard of is something called the Internet of Things, or smart devices. This is where you've got things like air quality monitoring sensors, temperature, meteorological sort of stations, weather stations out there. They're all connected to the internet, ultimately trying to optimize resource use or waste disposal. Smart agriculture is a really interesting one. Recently, farmers have started using drones and sensors in the soil to reduce the amount of fertilizer or the amount of other chemicals that they're using on their fields, so that they're kind of being more efficient and therefore more cost effective with their material, but they're reducing the amount of runoff of fertilizer and other things onto, into water courses, into streams, and so on and so forth. So there are some really interesting sort of promising applications for smart devices. The other thing is, I think the future of, one of the things I missed off earlier, we were talking about AI is, I think the future of AI is going to be far more about our phones and less about big gigantic data centers. I think at the moment we're in this very early gold rush with artificial intelligence, where the brute force piece I was talking about earlier is the dominant sort of pattern. I think what we're seeing, and there's a rumor that Apple is very much about to launch something that's going to run far more on device, and that will be better for privacy, it'll consume less power, and generally be under your control rather than a big tech company's control. So there's some interesting sort of signs of taking this sort of edge, what's known as edge computing. So you put the computing as close to the edge or where the work is happening as possible, rather than in the data center where they're obviously centralized and in a big warehouse. So this sort of pattern of trying to push things out to the real world is a really positive one, I think. So that's pretty much me done. There's a few links I can share these slides. There's some articles out there from MIT. There's also a really good video that was produced by Business Insider looking at the American data centers specifically. So that's well worth a watch. It's only about 10 minutes or so. And the crazy thing is about the US data centers, just going back to that for a moment, is Virginia has something like 70% of the world's internet traffic. So Virginia near Washington. And there is parts of Virginia now where people can't sleep because the data centers are so loud and they're close to residential areas that they're affecting people's ability to sleep. So it's not just having impacts on nature, it's having real world impacts on, on people. And I think the US is starting to feel that because they've not really thought about the knock-on implications of a lot of this infrastructure. So look, hopefully that's been useful, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Oliver. It's a very well-balanced argument there. And if you would please, if you've got any questions, thank you.
Good evening. Thanks for that. It was really, really interesting. I wanted to ask about recycling devices.
Yep.
And why it hasn't really taken off much, because you often read articles about how China has like a sort of monopoly of rare earth mineral mining, and yet we have loads and loads of devices which you could technically recycle the materials from. Can you? I mean, is it possible to recover everything from a phone, or well, from devices in general, or do you still need like fresh material?
Yeah, it's hard. The problem with our electronics is they've got smaller and smaller, and miniaturization has meant it's harder to then disassemble the equipment at the end of life to then recover the materials. The other problem is the economics. Unfortunately, at the moment, the economics just tend to favor virgin materials, digging them out of the ground. It's mad. I think that will change, particularly if China starts getting quite defensive about its rare earth supply in response to sort of geopolitics. It is possible to recover a lot more than we are. I think part of the problem is that often people don't know they need to put their device in somewhere specific rather than just putting it in the bin. Putting it in the bin is just horrendous, right? Particularly if it's got a battery or something like that will then just leak into the ground. So yeah, there are some really interesting research programs going on to look at recovering more materials and to do so in a less damaging way, because unfortunately you often have to use quite strong chemicals to break down circuit boards and recover material. And as I say, in a lot of cases people end up burning electronic circuit boards because they've got quite a lot of gold and other precious metals in them. So the kind of easiest way to release that, if you don't have sophisticated equipment, is literally to set it on fire, as you saw in the video. So yeah, it is possible. It's just going to require policy change and investment, quite frankly, in recovery. The other thing is, I think we're going to look at, we've not really touched on vehicles, but like electric vehicles, there's a massive potential application there to like recovering lithium. The reality is the batteries actually find a second life in electric vehicles. I think once we've seen the sort of second life of those electric vehicle batteries play out, so powering people's homes with solar and things like that, that's when I see the market actually being enough supply. The problem in our case is there isn't enough volume to make the processing of the material sort of cost effective. So yeah, it's a complex, multi-layered thing. The other thing I will say is, even if you just look at plastics, like ignore the electronics for a moment, I got talking to someone who is running an eco-friendly chemical cleaning business in the UK, and he had to plead with a UK government UK government, local government authority. They were just shipping their plastics to the Far East, and he was like, no, can I have some? I want to process it, I want to recover it, and literally it was crazy. Like, no, the process was that plastic went overseas, and that was that. So I think we have to sort of start to sort of, reimagine, because I think the reality is the junk is gold. It literally is in a lot of cases, and we have to sort of rethink how those material flows get changed. But yeah, it's not a simple one. But to go back to the short sort of final point, it is possible. It's just not being done enough at the moment.
Yeah, thank you for the talk. What's your feeling on distributed solutions versus kind of the centralized data centers. Like it seemed that these big centralized data centers seem quite negative or have kind of negative properties. But are there any advantages of having it all kind of centralized rather than everyone having their own kit and then that being more e-waste?
Yeah, no, there's a reason why we have big centralized data centers, in that they do, at the moment, are able to do things we can't do on end devices. So a classic example of that is ChatGPT. You wouldn't be able to build that AI model in right now on people's end user devices. You need all of that infrastructure in one place to do that. So there are certain workloads, like weather modeling, like the Met Office, they need a huge supercomputer right now to do the weather calculations, the weather forecasting. So at the moment, a lot of the high-end processing needs to be done at scale. But I think when I talk about AI, the reality is there's only so many models we need to train, and then we'll want to run them and use them. And it's the running and using them that doesn't have to live in the big centralized data centers. So when it comes to AI, we will always need large data centers for certain things, like building the models in the first place, but it doesn't mean we need them for everything to do with AI. So I think it's a balance. And I think where we've seen is the pendulum swing to centralization. And I think I talked about the PC era. When I was growing up, the PC was a real democratizing force. It allowed people to kind of do computing that previously couldn't because it was a big mainframe in a big business somewhere. And I think we're going to start, hopefully, to see that pendulum shift back again so that there's some empowerment of people. Because otherwise, my fear is this way too much centralized control of the people that own the data centers and the big tech firms will just have so much IP, let alone infrastructure, that it's a bit of a concern. So I'm optimistic that that pendulum can swing back towards, sort of distributed. But they are different. If you go look at technically for a moment, they are different platforms that solve different problems. But I think that the reality is we're over-indexing and we're shoehorning everything into the centralized approach too much at the moment.
Here's my voice. One of the impacts of artificial intelligence is going to be on employment. How do you see that working out? I mean, the suggestions are that in one way we'll need a much better trained workforce, and another suggestion is we won't need nearly as many. So we've got a particular conundrum there, I think.
Yeah, I think the last point is interesting, and I would ask everyone to question who is saying that, because I think the narrative that we won't need people is often the narrative of the big tech companies trying to sell this dream of like these multi-purpose, these general purpose tools that, quite frankly, still quote wrong invented bits of case law, to solicitors. So I think yes, there will be an impact to employment. 100%. I think what I'm already seeing with my team and my use of the tool is that researching and certain things that would have taken like longer can now be done quicker. I see it as a tool though, and I think it's your point about getting people ready. I think training people to know how to use the tool is going to be really, really important. And it's a bit like a new digital divide, quite frankly. Like previously, the divide was, did you have internet connectivity or did you have a computer at home or not? I think increasingly it's going to be, do you understand how to use AI or not, will be what maybe makes the difference with your employment going forwards. The other thing that drastically needs to change is academia. Like there is at the moment a bit of the Royal Society event brought this up as well. There is a bit of a pitch battle at the moment about AI, like whether AI should be anywhere near academia or not. And I think the reality is it needs to be nuanced. Like we do need to start learning how to use these tools, because they're not going back, that genie's not going back in the bottle, right? So yeah, I think we do need to find a way, but we do need to be mindful that I think there's a certain narrative about the inevitability of mass employment replacement with machines. I'm not convinced that's actually true. I think there are companies using AI as a convenient excuse for why they're making layoffs. And if you dig deeper into some of the headlines, that's some of the reality. But certainly in my world, in the software world, it's having already a massive impact and will continue to do so. Like how much we will write software ourselves as people, typing it, I think those days are probably numbered. But there will almost certainly be a person involved in the creation of software. So I think it's a bit like, do we plow fields directly with hand tools? No, we have tractors. I think the reality is that hopefully people go up the sort of value chain and that they supervise, but I don't see it having the kind of sweeping replacement sort of fears that I think many are seeding. I think that's a bit of a marketing spin.
Oliver, there's a question online from Kaz, sort of two parts already. How near to the cliff are we? How much time to implement infrastructure change? And the second part is also, what about decentralized internet? We all share a portion of the data storage. Is daisy chaining the right word?
Yeah, so let me pick off the second one first. So I think this, and Tim Berners-Lee, I don't know if you know, Tim Berners-Lee is the inventor of the World Wide Web. He was working in CERN. He's a British chap, amazing guy. And he has been trying to push this concept of distributed internet for some time. There's nothing stopping us doing that, all sort of owning part of the internet. Look at early music sharing. Yes, it was illegal, sharing music with each other, but it showed the pattern is possible. That you can essentially decentralize storage and store parts of the internet on computers ourselves. Look at things like Bitcoin and cyber cryptocurrencies. I'm not a massive fan of the amount of wasted energy of Bitcoin, but it does show that you can push out the work essentially to people's computers. So I think the distributed computing pattern is fascinating. The more I look into some of the companies like Distributive, who are a Canadian startup doing some really interesting things, particularly in the academic world, where any computer can essentially join a science experiment. Like if you're doing some research that involves using computing, you can essentially fire up your browser and it can join the network, as it were, and it can be part of the university's compute cluster, as it were. So there's some really interesting sort of ideas that aren't really being explored. And just quickly, before I go on to the first question, the reason is there's a huge amount of power in monopolies right now with tech. There's a reason why platforms kind of get to a critical mass and then become the de facto. It's very hard once some of these technologies get to a certain scale to compete as like a smaller startup or as a distributed solution. It's often profit and money that's the reason why we aren't seeing these grassroots initiatives. The first point about how close to the cliff are we? I don't want to make precise sort of predictions of when the bubble will burst. Or I've been saying this for the last 18 months, and I haven't. I've been careful not to give a specific date. I think we're talking months, not years. Some of the claims are just extraordinary. Certain tech companies are just pouring further fire on the flames of the hype that we're in. And a lot of people are falling for it, quite frankly. Not everyone is tech savvy. And therefore, it's frustrating as someone who is a technologist to see a lot of people being hoodwinked, quite frankly, by a technology that, yes, looks impressive on the surface, but the reality is probably isn't quite going to hit the heady heights that is being projected. But what I do see is some really promising signs of other approaches. Like you look at DeepMind and AlphaFold 3, which is doing protein discovery. Fascinating. And it's not a brute force approach. It's a combination of different approaches. It's human expertise, it's AI, it's more traditional machine learning approaches. So I think how far away we are from sort of either coming off the tracks or hitting the cliff, hard to exactly say, but I think there are promising signs of people doing things in better ways. The one thing I would say to check out is worldview models as well. There are a lot of people that were originally very bullish on large language models, now saying, no, we can't figure out intelligence just by ingesting all the world's words and content. We need our AI to be a bit like a baby. It needs to explore the world with its own sort of cameras or whatever its vision. It needs to process the world. It needs to understand gravity. It needs to understand pure concepts, pure conceptual reality rather than just how it's described in human language. And it's probably going to be a blending of those two things that will probably get us to that and scale us up that wall that the climbers are going up. So yeah, I'm optimistic. I just think at the moment we're being distracted because a lot of people are making quite a lot, a few people are making quite a lot of money out of the current approach.
Really interesting talk, thank you. Couple of questions or points. You've got a meeting with the government, did you say? Curious to hear about sort of interest and appetite and understanding from that side of things. I think one thing that stood out that you said earlier was it in Amsterdam when you said the government just said no? Really it has to be at that sort of level, doesn't it, for sort of change to happen? That's my first question. The second one you touched on just then, which is it's all about money. Is there, do you think, any possibility of the big drivers that are currently making all the money investing in some of these alternative future things that you're talking about and actually seeing, the whole process as a money-making venture? Look, alternative energy, has come in at the point at which it becomes economically sensible for it to happen. And really, that's what is needed to happen one way or another, isn't it?
Yeah.
And maybe governments can help accelerate that, but yeah.
Yeah, so I think there are companies watching and waiting. I can't remember if I mentioned Apple. So they are rumoured, there is a rumour doing the rounds that there is a project called Veritas that they're working on, which will be more about using the phone and the Apple Mac and their other devices to run AI locally. I think the reality is most of the tech sector knows that this is a very inefficient approach. And a lot of people in tech are very frustrated that it is so inefficient and bloated, and particularly when people realise quite how bad it is, they're like, this is madness. There are better ways of approaching these problems. So I think it is just a matter of time before one of the big tech players goes, do you know what? A bit like DeepSeek did, and it didn't quite have the effect I think it was going to have, I think, because there was just so much force behind the investment in the current approach. But essentially that you can run this AI on your device, like my machine. Yeah, I can run a model on my machine. It's a little bit more technical to do that than firing up a website right now, but it's not far off as easy. And it's that knowledge gap, I think, that's stopping that from happening. In terms of the government conversations, as Jackie said when I was introduced, I'm part of the Government Digital Sustainability Alliance, which is a consortium of suppliers, technology suppliers to government and government departments. So we're having a lot of conversations about AI. I am part of the AI working group, and we are actively working to have at least standards for government, if not, in time, hopefully, some influence on regulation that puts some sensible sort of checks and balances on how AI is procured, designed, built, and operated. It's an ongoing conversation. I'm pleased to say some of the AI playbook will now have sustainability chapters in it as a result of our work. Previously, there was like one line that said, think about the environmental impacts of what you're doing, and that was it. So now the next version of it will have a bit more detail of things for people to go and ask their providers. I think transparency is a big thing that everyone, particularly in a corporate role or a government role, buying technology can ask is just start being more demanding when it comes to metrics and data, because that's really what's missing. And until there's the sorts of, I think, regulation that the EU is bringing out with data centers where companies have to report on energy consumption and water consumption and other impacts, until that is like a level playing field, you'll get some players being very open, like some of the UK companies are, like Deep Green, the ones that are powering the swimming pools. There are some companies that are being open, but they're typically the smaller players. So yeah, I think it's doable. And yeah, I can talk to you offline a little bit more about the government conversations that are happening in a few weeks.
I had a quick question for you, actually.
Yeah.
A quick one. I just wanted to ask about whether it feels like consumers generally are quite aware of recycling and, they're getting more aware of their carbon footprint, turn the lights off, etc. Yet people are searching online, and probably there's a switch up in terms of usage when now they're using AI. Mm-hmm. And I just wondered whether there are any ways of showing what a personal carbon footprint looks like for what people search for, and whether there's any moves to sort of to make people aware of their, the environmental damage of their searching.
Yeah, so I do a fair bit of work with an organisation called the Green Web Foundation, and they are an organisation that's pushing for a fossil-free internet, basically, to try and decarbonise the internet. And they've had a tool for some time that websites can use to help people using the website see what the impact of the website use are. So there are these tools. I think the problem with a lot of them is they're quite technical at the moment. They're either technical in the sort of IT sense of technical, or they're technical in the sustainability sense. Like they talk about greenhouse gas emissions, CO2, equivalents or kilograms. It doesn't help. It probably needs to be put into the context of this is like a flight to New York, or this is an average car journey. So yeah, I think what I'd love to see is like eco-labeling, like product labeling, like you get your fridge or whatever on these laptops for starters, because I think so many people would probably maybe think differently about their buying decisions if they knew that these things had such impact that they do. I mean, like in TVs, for example, like we have the energy rating, but we don't have the manufacturing rating, which is really missing for me. So yeah, I think there are some things that could be brought in, and I'm optimistic that when people learn more about this, that they want to do something about it. The problem is I'm sort of fighting against a tide of marketing from very well-funded companies that want to make everyone think that technology is clean, green, and wonderful. And don't get me wrong, there are some great things going on out there. There are some great investments in renewables and other things, but the balance isn't quite where it needs to be. Thanks for the question. Thanks for all the questions, actually. It was great.
Well, thank you so much, Oliver. That was absolutely fascinating. Thank you. If you'd like to give you a round of applause to him.